All right, let's go ahead and open up in prayer. God, thank you for allowing us to be here tonight and to study your word. God, I pray you give us eyes to see and ears to hear, that we can have an understanding of who you are and your goodness, your greatness. As we look at the story of Esther, we're pointed to you and your son, that we would be made more like you. Just then pray. Amen. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Ryan, and I'm fairly new here. I've been on staff since the beginning of January. I'm the pastor of adult education. So JJ has given me the opportunity to teach some on Wednesdays. And leading up to this, I've received a lot of encouragement. JJ's a really nice guy, and he said, hey, as long as you don't blow it on Wednesday, I'll let you teach again next week. All right? So if I'm back next week, it went okay. If I'm not here, you know what happened. Okay? Stroop told me, hey, if nobody shows up next week, don't let it bother you. It's okay. We're going to spend the next couple months here looking at Esther. So if you'll open up to Esther chapter 1. So Esther's tucked in between Nehemiah and Job. So if you find Psalms, go backwards a couple books and you'll find it. And tonight we're going to give some background, some history, just to make sure we understand the setting that this is taking place in. And then we're going to look at chapter 1. And this is a historical book, but our purpose here is not to just learn history or learn facts or learn about Esther and Mordecai. Our purpose is really to learn about God's providence, like his hand at work throughout history. So while we're learning some history, we're also going to see God at work throughout history. And there's something I want us to keep at the forefront of this is this overarching theme in the book of Esther is God's providence, like how he cares and loves for his people. So this book is about Esther, and it's a really good story with a lot of things we can learn in it. But keep God at the forefront every week, right? As we look at Esther, we're going to keep God's goodness, his glory, his sovereignty, like at the forefront of our minds as we dig into Esther, so we don't get lost in the details and lose sight of the big picture. So to give you an idea of the setting, I sometimes struggle with this, especially in the Old Testament, is as I'm reading, what else is going on in the world? And I used to, when I would read the Old Testament especially, I just thought like as you read it, that was the order of events as they happened. Like every book was in order, and that's not really the case. So to give you an idea, Esther is set in the kingdom of Persia, right? And there's a map up there for you, and you can see just how vast the kingdom was. And she's under, the king is Ahasuerus, right? Your Bible may say Xerxes, it's the same guy. And he's going to rule this kingdom with absolute power. And the time frame is, if you think of David, he's been gone for about 500 years at this point. If you think of Daniel, he's been gone for about 50 years at this point. So it was the Babylonian Empire that came and carried Daniel off into captivity. And then the Persian Empire, Xerxes' great-grandfather, is going to come conquer the Babylonian Empire and set this empire up where we find Esther. And it starts in 483 BC, and the book is going to cover a span of 9 to 12 years. Some historians say 12, some historians say 9, so we're just going to say it falls somewhere in that span. It falls right in line with Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah comes on the scene about 40 years after Esther in the same setting. It's the king who's here in chapter 1. It's his son that's going to send Nehemiah back to rebuild Jerusalem. And there's a span in Ezra between chapter 6 and 7 of about 50-year gap. And Esther falls right into that 50-year gap. So if you were to read Ezra 1 through 6, that's before Esther. Starting chapter 7 to the end of Ezra, that's after the events that are taking place here in Esther. If you're interested in secular history, This is the king who, if you've seen the movie 300, he goes and he fights Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. This is that king. And in chapter 1, he's starting to prepare for that invasion. Okay, so whenever we're going to read about his banquet that he's hosting, he's getting ready to go try to defeat Greece. All right? So that's kind of the setting that we're in. And by the map, you can see it's a large kingdom. At that time, is the largest on earth. He's going to try to expand it and go into Greece. The king cannot be questioned. He rules with absolute authority. And we're going to see that becomes a problem here in chapter 1. It's a pagan religion. They wouldn't have believed in God. And so for Esther and Mordecai to live out their faith would have been a little bit of an issue for them. They wouldn't have been in the mainstream of people who did that. We don't know who the author is. A lot of people say it was Mordecai. Some others say Ezra or Nehemiah. What we do know is that it was someone who knew Persian culture and most likely was an eyewitness to the events. And some interesting things, Esther doesn't mention the name of God. Right? So nowhere in here are we going to see God mentioned by name. But as we look at the events, we're going to see that he's very present. Even like sometimes when it seems like he's taken a little bit of a back seat and he's not at the forefront, he's constantly working throughout the book, and none of these events are happening by accident. And there's a whole lot of lessons we can take from Esther, and each chapter we could pull out these lessons, but I want to focus on the overarching theme of Esther, and that's God's providence. And I want to look at how God cares for his people and how he's in control and he's somehow working events out even whenever things don't seem possible. We're not sure how things can work. When Esther's in this situation, as we're going to get into, keep in mind that Esther doesn't know how things play out. And much like we don't know how things play out sometimes in situations in our lives. We can read Esther and see like, oh, this is a great story, and we see the end. And because we see the whole picture, we realize, oh, God was working here. Esther didn't always see that. And it's the same thing in our lives that we don't always see. When we're in the thick of the moment, we may not see how God is working, but he is, right? He's always at work. So keep that in mind. Like even whenever we seem like we can't see him, he's at work, and his providence is taking care of everything. Some of the main characters, we have Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, same guy, depending on what translation of the Bible you have. He's king, and Esther will be his queen, so Esther's our main character. She'll come on the scene in chapter 2. Her cousin Mordecai is also a main character. He'll be introduced in chapter 2. And kind of the antagonist is Haman, and he's on the scene in chapter 3. And just to give you an idea, if you don't know the story of Esther, the Jewish people are going to be threatened in Esther. Like that's the main plot here, is that Haman wants to destroy the Jewish people, and God's made a promise to them, and so he's going to have to keep that promise. So let's read chapter 1 of Esther. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. While he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So he's showing this feast for 180 days. Now, not everyone would have been there the entire time. Governors would have come from different regions. They would have been there for a while and they would have gone back. Others would have come in. But it's given us the idea that it's very lavish, that they're eating in just amazing meals. The drinks are flowing. He is showing his richness, right? And he's also probably going through plans of how they're going to invade Greece. Like there was a little bit of a purpose to this. Verse 5. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And the drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So when it says there in verse 8, there's no compulsion, what he was saying is the people can drink as much or as little as they want. So there were certain times where if the king drank, everyone else had to drink. So if he raised his glass, you had to raise your glass. If he was on his third round, you had to be on your third round, or else you might get asked to leave. And he's saying that's not the case. We can relax. People can drink as much or as little as they want. And then Queen Vashti is throwing a separate party for the women in another area of the palace. Verse 10. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So we don't know why she refused. Okay? We just know that she did. And there's lots of theories on this. Some people say when he says she was to come wearing her crown, he wanted her to wear only her crown. And she refused because she didn't want to be in front of all the drunk men like that. Other ideas say in Persia, a married woman would have worn a veil around other men. And he was asking her not to wear a veil, and she wanted to be modest. Some say she just didn't like the king, so she refused. One idea is that she was pregnant. Another one says maybe she had leprosy. There's all these ideas. Ultimately, we don't know really why she refused. We just know that she did, and that God is using that to ultimately bring about his plan and his purpose. Verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Carshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard about the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. Let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as he proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man may be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. So there's a couple key parts here. When it says that the king put something in writing and it can't be repealed, that's important, and it's going to come into play later in the book. When he puts his stamp on it, it means nothing can change. So when he wrote this, it meant it didn't matter how he ended up feeling, if he regretted his decision. It meant that the queen was never to come into his presence again. And we're not told what happens to her. I have lots of ideas on this as well. Some say she was killed. Some say she was just banned to a part of the palace where she wouldn't see the king. Maybe she was sent to a different part of the empire. We're not told. We know that he divorced her and she lost her queenship. There is one idea that later her son would rule the empire, and we know from history that that son was greatly influenced by his mother. So there's a lot of historians that believe that she remained alive and later had influence in the kingdom again. But as far as the Bible goes, it doesn't tell us, and maybe we don't need to know, right? We just know that she was not the queen anymore. And really what that tells us is God was setting the stage for something else, okay? And these guys, they have this issue. It seems their wives don't respect them. And they're like, hey, king, you rule this great empire, and your wife just disrespected you. Like, what are we going to do about this? Because we're going to go home, and our wives are going to hear about this, and they're not going to do what we say. And so they're asking the king, hey, I need you to take care of this. And let's just think about this, men. How effective is it to go, hey, let's put something in law, and let's punish this other woman over here to make our wives really love and honor us? It doesn't work really well, okay? And these guys are kind of missing the boat, like, hey, I'm not even worthy of honor and respect in my own home, so let's put it into law that my wife needs to do what I say, right? And they're missing the boat. But that's what they did. And we're going to see that God's going to take this bad advice and he's going to use it to something good. So now that we have some background, we've read chapter 1, let's get some perspective on like what's going on here. What are we trying to learn? Really, what is Esther teaching us? So remember, we're gonna look at it from a whole standpoint. What are we learning from the book of Esther? Romans 15:4 says, "For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope." So Esther was written for a reason. And what hope do we find? And what we're going to find is that God fulfills his covenant promises through his providence. So the covenant promise he's keeping here is the promise he made to Abraham to make him a great nation, right? And that the world will be blessed through Abraham. Ephesians 1:11 tells us that God works everything out in conformity with the purpose of his will. So he works Vashti refusing to come before the king out according to his will. He works the king losing his temper according to God's will. Think of Esther, her story. She's an orphan. God uses that and works it according to his will, not an easy situation. He takes Babylon coming and taking the Jewish people into captivity. He works that into his plan. He takes the Persian Empire conquering Babylon. He takes that into his plan. Like, he doesn't let anything just happen by accident, right? The fact that they're still in the main part of the Persian Empire is not by accident. Like, he has a plan for all these things. And it's amazing to look back on a story and just see him weave things together. Like, in a way that we can't even comprehend. And yet he's taking all these different aspects, some of which seem like they're unrelated or just happenstance, and he's putting them all together to work out his plan to bring about his purpose. What's his purpose, right? He's keeping his covenant with Abraham, but in John 4, when Jesus is talking to the lady at the well, he tells her salvation is from the Jews, right? So he's not only keeping his covenant with Abraham, he's working out his plan for salvation to come in Jesus, right? Because the Jewish people were going to be threatened with extinction, essentially. And God's not going to let that happen. And so in chapter 1, he's setting this stage up that he's going to put Esther on in chapter 2. And he's preparing the kingdom for that. He's also preparing Esther for that. Think of all the times in our lives that we go, oh, God, in this season that maybe we didn't understand, and then we come through the season and we go, oh, this is what God was preparing me for. This is how God was at work. And we can't see it when we're in the moment. Esther wouldn't have seen it whenever she was in the moment, right? But he's always working things out. Right? And here he's setting the stage in chapter 1. And what can we learn from Esther? Well, I hope we're going to learn to trust God. We're going to learn that God's really in control in an empire where it seems like the king's in control and no one can question him, that God's actually the one behind the scenes carrying everything out, working everything out. And I hope we learn to trust God's providence and we learn to act in confidence, act in courage, knowing that it's not really us who's in charge. We're going to see Esther do that. She's going to step before the king, not knowing what's going to happen, but she does have faith enough to know who's actually in control. I think of Ruth. Ruth was destined to be a widow, live in poverty, and it says that she took refuge under the wings of God, not knowing how her situation would play out. Like, God, if this is my plot in life to be a widow who lives in poverty, you're enough. Right? Do we trust God in that he's enough? We don't know how things play out. Matthew 11, 28 and 30, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Right? When we learn to trust God, that he's in control, that he's taking care of things, we find rest for our souls. Right? That we don't have to be the ones in charge. We have a responsibility, but he's the one working things out. So what's the main idea? What message is the author here sending us? What does he want us to know? What does he want us to figure out? Even if we take the details out, what's the message? Well, the message is providence. So let's talk about providence. It's the protective care of God. R.C. Sproul calls it the strong, invisible hand of God, which I think is a very fitting definition for a book that never mentions God. It's a strong, invisible hand of God. He's at work here in Esther. He's at work throughout history, bringing about his purpose, his plan. It's the idea that God has a foresight into what's going to happen, and he's working things out the entire time to make sure his plan comes about. It's the idea of Romans 8:28, all things work together for good for those who love him. Verse 29, we find out that good is that we are made more like Christ in these situations. Right? And he works his providence out, absolute power, right? Perfect righteousness. Here's a quote on providence. Providence means that the hand of God is in the glove of human events. When God is not at the steering wheel, he is the backseat driver. He is the coach who calls the signals from the bench. Providence is the unseen rudder on the ship of state. God is the pilot at the wheel during the night watch. As someone has said, he makes great doors swing on little hinges. God's the one in control. He's in control in Esther. He's in control today. He's in control in our lives when they're going good, when they're going bad. We're on the mountaintop, we're in the valley. But we have to learn to trust him in those things. We learn to trust him in the mountaintop. We trust him in the valley. Right? That he has perfect knowledge of our situation, that he's in absolute control of it, even when we may not realize that, and that no one or no thing escapes his control. Here's a quote about the book of Esther. The crisis about which the book is written is providentially anticipated and then providentially overruled just at the crucial moment. No miraculous intervention is resorted to. All the happenings recorded are the outworking of circumstances in their natural sequence. Yet while there is no miracle recorded, the whole thing, in its ultimate meaning, is a mighty miracle. The mighty miracle whereby the sovereign deity so manipulates all non-miraculous events as to bring about a predetermined outcome. And this miracle is all the more miraculous just because it achieves the predetermined outcome without the need for using miracles. We don't see any miracles in Esther, but God is at work, right? We see God at work in the New Testament through his miracles most of the time. But here we're going to see that he's at work even when we don't see miracles. He's at work whenever we see him in our lives working out miracles, when we don't see him working out miracles, right? He's at work. He has our good at heart. So what do we learn from chapter 1? The overarching theme is that we're God's providence. He's in control. What are some lessons we can take from chapter 1? Well, it's a pretty good explanation of why the Bible says don't be drunk with wine. We have a king here who, if he hadn't been drunk, probably wouldn't have taken the bad advice that he took. He probably would have never asked his queen to come parade around in front of all these men. He wouldn't have made a rash decision, and he wouldn't have lost his queen. So there's a lesson we can take away from chapter 1. We can look at the proverb that says pride comes before a fall. We have a very prideful king here. And he says, I can tell my wife to do whatever I want. She's going to do it. And she says, actually, no, I'm not. And he loses his queen. He says, hey, everybody in my kingdom, come look at my riches. And then he goes and invades Greece and he's defeated. Right? So pride comes before a fall. Proverbs 16:32, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city. The king here ruled a great empire, and yet he had no control over his anger and his temper. We could compare their marriage in Esther 1 to Ephesians 5. Right? We see that this is not a godly marriage. It's not a good example. Compared to Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wife like Christ loves the church. Lay your life down for her, that you can present her holy and blameless. Well, the king here didn't have his queen's best interest in mind. And we learn that God's design puts a guardrail and protection around our marriage. That's a good lesson to take from Esther 1. But in the grand scheme of things, take away this, that we need to take God into account in everything we do, right? That he's in control, that in his providence here, he's going to take a drunk queen, bad advice, bad decisions, a wife who refuses to do what her husband says, and he's going to bring about his purpose. And he's going to do that through an orphan who he's going to take and make queen, and he's going to use her to deliver his people, right? And so the hand of God is evident in this book. It's evident throughout. It's evident in our lives when we choose to see it. Right? And he has our good at heart. Doesn't mean that we don't face hardships. Just means that he's at work in them and that he's there with us. So last point, what does this tell us about God? Well, Sunday, we took the kiddos over to the Kings and we were looking through their telescope. And this was, I've never seen at night, I've never looked at the planets through a telescope, and it was pretty eye-opening. So we looked at Jupiter, and I could see the moons. I saw 4 of the moons all lined up. I'd never seen that before. And we don't realize, when you go outside and you just look up, you don't realize the greatness of it. You also don't realize how small we are. So I'm looking through the telescope, and it's zoomed in, and all of a sudden, Jupiter's out of sight. And he's like, hang on, I got to adjust it. You have to adjust it fairly often because we're moving so fast. When I go outside and look up, I don't notice that. If I look up long enough, I may notice a little bit. It's like, oh, we're pretty small. Like we rotate at 1,000 miles an hour. We don't even notice it. We go around the sun at some 67,000 miles per hour. And just looking through that gave me a little bit of perspective. And I look at the moon, and I realize, like, it's pretty big. And you see the craters and all this, and you go, God created this. Right? Like, he created that. He hung these things in space, and he holds them together. He put us here. David started telling our kids, like, did you know if the earth was in any different, like farther away from the sun or closer to the sun, or if anything was different, we would never get a full eclipse, right? But we get a full eclipse. It's because God hung us perfectly, exactly where he wanted us. And I started to realize, like, I can't even comprehend the greatness of God. Can't even fathom it. But then when we look at Esther, we realize God's not only like creator and great, he's also very personal. He takes care of Esther in this book, but he also is so personal that he made a promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, and here in Esther, he's going to hold on to that promise. And he's going to hold on to that promise because he wants to bring about a plan of salvation for us. He's a very personal God. Colossians 1:15-17 says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." The Son was at creation. It says all things were created through him. All things were created for him. He holds all things together. And yet the Son laid all that down to come to earth and go to the cross. Because in Esther, God held his covenant to Abraham so that he could bring about his plan of salvation for us. Pretty amazing. Right? And maybe we can't fathom the greatness of God, and I cannot fathom the goodness of God either. That he would work all this out in his plan. So as we look at Esther, it's a story about Esther, and there's a lot of lessons we can take away from it that are valuable. We can look at her courage and her faith, and those are really good things. But don't lose sight that this is about God at work, right? And in his providence, he's working things out throughout history. And there are details in this story that we don't get, right? But God gives us exactly what he wants us to have so we can respond to him, that we can realize his greatness and his goodness. Let's pray. God, thank you for the book of Esther. I thank you for your goodness, your greatness. God, I pray you would just lay that on our hearts. God, how much you care and love for us. I thank you for allowing us to see your goodness here, God, that you provide, that we can trust that you're in control. Just pray. Amen.